The transformation of deep affection into deadly malice presents a chilling and complex study in human behavior. The question resonates with profound and unsettling truth. What happens when a broken heart turns deadly? This narrative explores the dark trajectory of a relationship's end, where emotional devastation metastasizes into an act of unimaginable revenge, shattering not just one life, but an entire family. It is a stark reminder that the collapse of love can, in extreme circumstances, unleash a destructive force, turning deeply personal betrayal into widespread tragedy. The story centers on a seemingly ordinary family, the Hunt family, whose lives were interwoven into the fabric of a peaceful suburban existence. Their home, nestled within a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, represented the quintessential image of American domesticity. It was a place of comfort, routine, and familial bonds, where children played, parents nurtured, and everyday life unfolded with predictable rhythm. This setting, characterized by its tranquility and perceived safety, would later become a stage for a horrific act of violence, a stark contrast of quiet suburban life it had once embodied. At the heart of this family was their daughter, Jessica Hunt, the primary victim around whom this tragic narrative revolves. Jessica was a vibrant young woman, actively engaged in her community and deeply connected to her family. Her life, like that of many young adults, was a blend of personal aspirations, academic pursuits, and budding romantic relationships. She represented the innocent optimism of youth, a life full of promise and unwritten chapters. Central to the unfolding tragedy was Michael Thorne, Jessica's boyfriend. Their relationship began like many others, with mutual attraction and a blossoming connection. In its initial stages, Michael was perceived as loving and attentive, seamlessly integrating himself into the Hunt family's life. He shared meals at their table, participated in family gatherings, and was welcomed into their home with warmth and acceptance. There was no outward indication of the disturbing potential that lay dormant within him, or the capacity for the extreme emotional volatility that would later define his actions. However, as the relationship progressed, a darker facet of Michael's personality began to emerge. Beneath the surface of his affectionate demeanor lay an unsettling possessiveness and a profound emotional instability. This latent darkness would eventually consume him, transforming him from a seemingly loving partner into a deeply disturbed individual, driven by a toxic cocktail of rejection, resentment, and a distorted sense of injustice. The family, initially accepting of him, would later grapple with the terrifying realization that they had unknowingly welcomed a wolf into their flock. To fully convey the profound emotional stakes of this narrative, the introduction provides glimpses into the Hunt family's idyllic life. Family photos would display their collective joy and connection. Smiling faces at holiday gatherings, candid shots from vacations, and images of daily interactions that exuded warmth and togetherness. These visuals established the normalcy and happiness that would later be tragically shattered. We would also see brief depictions of their everyday routines, perhaps the parent preparing breakfast, children leaving for school, or Jessica herself engaged in her daily activities. These mundane yet powerful images create a deep emotional connection, allowing the audience to understand profound loss that would soon unfold. The purpose is to highlight the vibrancy of the lives that existed before the tragedy, underscoring the irreversible impact of a singular, vengeful act. This careful establishment of the family's peaceful existence sets the stage for the dramatic descent into heartbreak and violence, making the ensuing events all the more poignant and devastating. The initial phase of the relationship between Jessica Hunt and Michael Thorne was characterized by an undeniable spark, a seemingly idyllic beginning that mirrored many young romances. It was a period of shared laughter, mutual discovery, and a burgeoning sense of connection that promised a bright future. The narrative begins by specifically explaining how the relationship began, a seemingly organic connection between two young people, drawn together by shared interests and a palpable attraction. They met through mutual friends, or perhaps a university event, and their bond quickly deepened. This initial period was marked by deep affection, apparent in their interactions, their public displays of closeness, and the way they spoke about each other. Their bond seemed genuine, rooted in a sincere attachment that was evident to those around them. As their relationship blossomed, Michael Thorne was gradually introduced to the Hunt family. This was a significant step, signaling a level of commitment and acceptance into Jessica's inner circle. He attended family dinners, joined them for weekend outings, and participated in holiday celebrations. He was initially charming and polite, making a favorable impression on Jessica's parents and siblings. They saw him as a respectful and attentive partner for their daughter, someone who genuinely cared for her. This integration into the family further solidified his presence in Jessica's life and, in turn, in the life of the entire Hunt household. The family's acceptance was a crucial element, building a sense of trust and normalcy around Michael, which would later make the subsequent events all the more shocking and tragic. However, as is often the case in young relationships, challenges began to surface. What started as minor disagreements gradually escalated into more significant conflicts, revealing underlying incompatibilities and vulnerabilities in Michael's character. The emotional dynamics shifted, and the affection that once defined their bond began to erode. The turning point arrived with the breakup of their relationship. The decision to end things was initiated by Jessica, a painful but necessary step as she recognized a growing dysfunction or an unhealthy possessiveness in Michael that she could no longer tolerate. The precise reasons for the breakup might have been a culmination of factors: Michael's increasing jealousy, his attempt to control Jessica's social life, or simply a growing realization on Jessica's part that their futures were not aligned. The moment of the breakup was marked by intense emotional dialogue reenacted. These reenactments would present the strained, difficult conversations between Jessica and Michael, capturing the raw emotion of a dissolving relationship. The dialogue would reveal Jessica's attempts to articulate her feelings, her desire for space, and her need to move on. In stark contrast, it would highlight Michael's reactions, his disbelief, his pleas, and crucially, his escalating anger and refusal to accept her decision. These reenactments would showcase the verbal confrontations, the difficult pronouncements of Jessica's intentions, and Michael's increasingly agitated responses. His words would convey a sense of injustice, a feeling of being wronged, and a desperate, clinging attachment that bordered on obsession. The dialogue would reveal his inability to process rejection in a healthy manner, foreshadowing the darkness that was beginning to consume him. The dissolution of the relationship, particularly Jessica's firm decision to move on, triggered a profound and dangerous psychological spiral within Michael. He interpreted the breakup not as a mutual parting of ways, but as a deep personal affront, a betrayal that he could not reconcile. This triggered his growing resentment and a profound sense of injustice. He began to see Jessica not as a partner with agency, but as someone who had wronged him, who had deprived him of something he felt entitled to. This resentment festered, fueled by a distorted perception of the breakup. He believed he had invested deeply, that he had been wronged, and that Jessica owed him something, perhaps a continued affection, or at the very least, an explanation that satisfied his wounded ego. This sense of injustice was not easily assuaged. It became a central focus of his internal narrative, an excuse for his escalating anger. His emotional state deteriorated rapidly. The initial sadness morphed into anger, which then transformed into an obsessive preoccupation with Jessica and a perceived wrong committed against him. This was not a healthy grieving process, but a descent into pathological fixation. He replayed conversations, misinterpreted Jessica's actions, and constructed a narrative where he was a victim and she the perpetrator. This internal narrative of victimhood fueled his desire for retribution. The resentment became a corrosive force, consuming his thoughts and pushing him towards increasingly irrational and dangerous behavior. The love that once defined their relationship had indeed turned sour, replaced by a bitter, toxic brew of rejection, anger, and a burning desire to punish those he believed had wronged him. This emotional unraveling set the stage for the terrifying escalation that would soon follow, transforming his personal heartbreak into a public danger. The resentment festering within Michael Thorne after the breakup with Jessica Hunt quickly transmuted into a dangerous and consuming obsession. This was not the natural grief or pain of a relationship ending. It was a pathological fixation that began to dominate his thoughts and actions, signaling a profound shift in his psychological state. His inability to accept Jessica's decision led him down a dark path, where his perceived injustice warped into a desperate need for control and, ultimately, revenge. His fixation manifested initially through increasingly intrusive behaviors. He began checking Jessica's phones, not through direct access, but perhaps by constantly calling and texting, scrutinizing her social media activity, or even attempting to guess passwords or find ways to monitor her digital life. These actions, even if not overtly successful, indicate a pervasive desire to know her every move, to understand her new connections, and to monitor her emotional state after the breakup. He would likely spend hours scrolling through her public profiles, analyzing photos, looking for any sign of her moving on, each discovery fueling his growing rage. This digital surveillance was a silent, insidious invasion of her privacy, a precursor to more direct forms of intrusion. Beyond the digital realm, Michael's obsession transitioned into physical intrusion. He began making visits without notice, appearing unexpectedly at places where Jessica frequented, her workplace, her gym, or even simply waiting outside her home. These were not casual, friendly encounters, but rather calculated appearances designed to assert his presence and to demonstrate his unwavering focus on her. These unannounced visits were often characterized by a disturbing intensity in his demeanor, his refusal to accept her boundaries, and his desperate pleas for reconciliation, which quickly morphed into thinly veiled threats. He might leave gifts she didn't want or notes she didn't ask for, demonstrating his inability to respect her rejection. His presence felt oppressive, transforming public spaces into uncomfortable arenas for Jessica. His refusal to accept closure became increasingly apparent. Despite Jessica's clear communication that the relationship was over, Michael relentlessly pursued contact, ignoring her requests for space. He might send lengthy, rambling messages, alternating between declarations of love and bitter accusations. He refused to acknowledge the finality of the breakup, consistently attempting to restart conversations, rehash old arguments, or simply demand her attention. This relentless pursuit, coupled with his visits, created a suffocating atmosphere for Jessica, denying her any peace or ability to move forward. This lack of closure on his part indicated a deeper psychological issue, a profound inability to process rejection, and a desperate need to maintain control over a situation that was clearly beyond his grasp. The narrative meticulously touches on the red flags that began to emerge with alarming consistency, serving as crucial indicators of Michael's deteriorating mental state and escalating danger. These signs, while perhaps dismissed individually at first, collectively painted a chilling picture of an individual spiraling out of control. One of the most concerning red flags was his increasing tendency to send aggressive messages. These were no longer just pleas or expressions of sadness. They became overtly threatening, accusatory, and often laced with anger. The tone shifted from desperation to menace. He might threaten self-harm if Jessica didn't return to him, or, more chillingly, imply harm to her, her loved ones, or himself if she continued to reject him. These messages, delivered through text, email, or social media, demonstrated a breakdown in his ability to regulate his emotions and a dangerous willingness to use intimidation to achieve his desired outcome. The language he used became more explicit, his threats more direct, signaling a dangerous escalation in his fixation. Concurrently, those around Jessica began to take notice. Her friends and family started growing uneasy about Michael's behavior. Jessica herself likely confided in them, sharing snippets of his relentless calls or the unsettling nature of his unannounced appearances. Her friends might have witnessed his outbursts or observed his possessive tendencies firsthand. Her family, particularly her parents, who had initially welcomed him, would have begun to feel a growing sense of discomfort and concern as they witnessed his refusal to accept the breakup. They might have advised Jessica to seek a restraining order or to involve law enforcement, sensing that Michael's behavior transcended typical heartbreak. Their uneasiness would have been a collective recognition that Michael's actions were abnormal and potentially dangerous, a shared apprehension that foreshadowed the tragedy to come. This collective unease served as a crucial, though tragically unheeded, warning, indicating that Michael's obsession was not just a private matter between two ex-partners, but public danger that was growing increasingly palpable. The subtle changes in his behavior, the increasingly aggressive communications, and the growing unease of those around Jessica were all critical markers indicating a dangerous trajectory. These were not isolated incidents, but a pattern of escalating obsession that, in retrospect, signaled a severe and unaddressed psychological disturbance. The failure to fully comprehend or adequately respond to these early warning signs would prove to be a tragic oversight, allowing Michael's dark obsession to fester and build toward a catastrophic tipping point. The groundwork for violence was being laid, unnoticed or misunderstood, as Michael's internal world spiraled into a dangerous obsession that would soon consume more than just his own life. The simmering resentment and escalating obsession within Michael Thorne had reached a critical threshold, fueled by Jessica Hunt's unwavering decision to maintain their separation. His persistent attempts to re-enter her life, his intrusive monitoring, and his increasingly aggressive messages had all been met with firm boundaries, solidifying a perception of an unbearable injustice. This constant rejection, particularly Jessica's refusal to provide the closure he demanded, pushed his fragile psychological state to a definitive tipping point. This was the moment where emotional turmoil transformed into concrete, destructive intent. The catalyst of this irreversible shift was a definitive, explicit rejection. This was likely a final, unequivocal statement from Jessica, perhaps delivered after one too many unsolicited visits or an especially aggressive message. This might have been a direct conversation where she clearly articulated that there was no possibility of reconciliation, that she desired no further contact, and that his behavior was causing her distress. It could have been through a cease and desist letter from a lawyer, a formal request for a restraining order, or even police intervention after a particularly troubling incident. Regardless of the exact medium, the message was absolute. The relationship was irrevocably over, and any further attempt at contact would be met with legal action. For Michael, this explicit rejection was not just the end of a relationship. It was the ultimate personal affront, a profound wound to his ego, and a final, undeniable confirmation of his perceived abandonment. It stripped away any lingering hope of reconciliation, replacing it with an overwhelming sense of loss and, crucially, a burning desire for retribution. Upon receiving this definitive rejection, Michael's reaction was immediate and extreme. He was devastated, but this devastation quickly curdled into uncontrollable enrage. The emotional pain of loss transmuted into a powerful, destructive fury. This was not a healthy expression of grief or anger. It was a pathological explosion of resentment, fueled by his distorted sense of entitlement and victimhood. His mind, already consumed by obsession, now fixated on a singular destructive goal, revenge. The rejection was not merely a personal slight. It was, in his warped perception, an ultimate betrayal that demanded an ultimate response. This rage was cold and calculating, transcending simple emotion and moving into the realm of determined malice. The depth of his fury manifested in overt and chilling ways. He began to make direct threats. These threats were no longer veiled or implied. They were explicit declarations of intent to cause harm. He might have threatened Jessica directly, promising to make her pay, or ensuring she would regret this. More terrifyingly, his threats extended beyond Jessica to include her family, specifically her parents and siblings, who had welcomed him into their home. He might have stated that if he couldn't have her, no one would, or that he would make her feel the pain he was experiencing, amplified many times over. These threats could have been delivered through phone calls and final, desperate messages, or even in person during a final, volatile encounter. The content of these threats was specific and chilling, detailing not just a desire for revenge, but a clear articulation of intent to inflict harm upon those closest to Jessica. He might have alluded to their home, their routines, or their vulnerability, demonstrating that he had been observing them, and his threats were not idle words but premeditated intentions. The gravity of these threats, while terrifying, was tragically overlooked or underestimated by Jessica and her loved ones. The narrative provides foreboding signs overlooked by loved ones, highlighting critical missed opportunities for intervention. These signs were not always obvious to those who were not fully immersed in Michael's psychological spiral. Perhaps Jessica's family, while uneasy about his behavior, didn't fully comprehend the depth of his rage or the seriousness of his threats, perhaps dismissing them as the desperate words of a jilted lover. They might have advised Jessica to simply block his calls or avoid contact, believing that time and distance would eventually resolve the issue. There might have been instances where Jessica herself minimized the danger, hoping that ignoring him would cause him to fade away. Friends might have suggested he would get over it, or that he was just blowing off steam. The sheer shock of the breakup itself might have overshadowed the warning signs, leading them to misinterpret the intensity of his threats. These overlooked foreboding signs could have included Michael acquiring a weapon, openly discussing his grievances with others in an increasingly disturbing manner, or even making practice runs or surveillance of the Hunt family home. Perhaps he had been seen loitering near their property, or an unfamiliar vehicle had been spotted nearby. The accumulation of these seemingly disparate warning signs, while present, did not collectively trigger the level of alarm necessary to fully comprehend the imminent danger. The pervasive belief that he would never really do anything like that, or he's just hurting, blinded them to the escalating threat. This tragic oversight, the inability to fully grasp the severity of Michael's mental deterioration and his vengeful intentions, created a window of opportunity for his dark plan to materialize. The explicit rejection served as a final spark, igniting a pre-existing tinderbox of obsession and rage, setting Michael on an irreversible path toward a devastating act of violence, a horrifying response to his perceived broken heart. The stage was now set for the ultimate tragedy. The explicit rejection, coupled with a profound sense of injustice festering within Michael Thorne, propelled him past the point of no return. His threats, once dismissed as empty words born of heartbreak, now morphed into a chilling, premeditated plan for retribution. The narrative now descends into the night of the crime, a meticulously reenacted sequence that reveals the devastating culmination of his obsession. This was not a spontaneous outburst of violence. It was a calculated act of vengeance designed to inflict maximum pain upon Jessica and her entire family. The atmosphere preceding the crime was thick with an unseen tension, carefully built through suspenseful narrative. The hours leading up to the invasion will be depicted with a growing sense of foreboding. Perhaps Michael spent days or even weeks meticulously planning, observing the Hunt family's routines, noting their patterns of light and activity, identifying weaknesses in their home security. He would have chosen his moment with chilling precision, likely late at night, when the family was asleep and most vulnerable. The narration would describe the quiet suburban street, the darkened windows of the Hunt home, perhaps a light breeze rustling through the trees, an eerie calm before the storm. This period of clandestine surveillance and planning underscored the cold, deliberate nature of his intent, transforming him from a jilted lover into a calculating killer. The critical moment arrived with shots of him breaking into the home. The act of forced entry would be depicted with stark realism. The quiet manipulation of a lock, the subtle jimming of a window, or perhaps a more forceful but swift breach through a back door. The sounds would be minimal, muffled, reflecting his predatory stealth as he infiltrated the sanctity of the family's dwelling. The visual depiction would focus on the invasion of space, the violation of the home's perceived safety, emphasizing the terrifying reality of an intruder entering a place where absolute security is expected. The lighting would be dim, casting long, unsettling shadows, reflecting the darkness of his intentions. His movements within the house would be quiet, purposeful, as he navigated a familiar layout that he had once been welcomed into, but now entered with malicious intent. Once inside, the murders unfold with a terrifying, predetermined sequence. The narrative would lay out the order of his victims, revealing the chilling progression of his vengeful assault on the entire family. It would detail the methodical nature of his actions, illustrating his intent to leave no survivors. The horror would begin with the children, likely targeted first to prevent any outcry or resistance. Their innocence tragically sacrificed his rage. This would be followed by the parents, who, upon discovering the intrusion, would attempt to protect their family, only to be overcome by Michael's brutal determination. Finally, his rage would culminate with the attack on Jessica herself, the primary object of his distorted obsession and ultimate revenge. The sequence of these murders, executed with chilling precision, highlights the depth of his malice and his desire to utterly devastate Jessica's world. The reenactment would avoid gratuitous detail, but convey the undeniable tragedy of each life taken. The cinematic tension of this sequence would be meticulously crafted through specific details. Glimpses of weapons would be brief but impactful, suggesting the tools as violence without lingering on them. Perhaps a glint of metal in the darkness, or the silhouette of a blunt object. The sounds of screams, muffled and short-lived, would punctuate the horrifying silence of the invasion, conveying the terror and pain of the victims without explicit depiction. The pervasive darkness within the house would symbolize the moral void of Michael's actions, obscuring precise horror while amplifying the dread. The only illumination might come from passing streetlights or the brief flash of a mobile phone screen, highlighting the vulnerability of the victims. Each element, the glimpses of the weapon, the stifled cries, the encroaching darkness, would contribute to an overwhelming sense of dread, drawing the audience into the terrifying reality of the home invasion and the brutal, irreversible outcome. This methodical recounting of the horrific act underscores the calculated nature of Michael's revenge, demonstrating how a broken heart mutated into a force capable of unimaginable destruction. The horrific act committed by Michael Thorne left a profound silence in the Hunt family home, a silence that carried the unbearable weight of unimaginable violence. But such darkness cannot remain hidden indefinitely. The narrative now shifts to the inevitable discovery, the meticulous process of investigation, the cold machinery of the legal system, an enduring human effort to comprehend and heal from such profound tragedy. The initial breach of this gruesome tableau occurred with the arrival of first responders. This was often triggered by an unanswered call from a concerned friend or family member, an unusual absence from work or school, or even a neighbor noticing something amiss, a door left ajar, an unfamiliar car, or a silence that felt too heavy. The moment they entered the home, the unspeakable reality of the crime scene unfolded before them. The initial response would be one of controlled chaos, as paramedics assessed the situation, quickly realizing no life could be saved, and uniformed police secured the scene. Their first priority was to ensure the immediate area was safe and to preserve any potential evidence. The methodical process of demarcation, the yellow tape, and the slow, deliberate movements of forensic teams will begin to transform the private tragedy into a public investigation. Within the confines of the home, the bodies were found, each discovery adding another layer to the horror. The scene itself would speak volumes, revealing the brutal sequence of events and the sheer scale of the violence. As the crime scene was meticulously processed, disturbing details began to emerge. The victims' ages were tragically noted. Innocent children, followed by their parents, then Jessica. This sequence often indicated a calculated, systematic attack, rather than a random act, highlighting the killer's intent to eliminate all witnesses and inflict maximum devastation upon Jessica's world. The sequence of events within the house would be pieced together by blood spatter analysis, forensic mapping, and the positions of the bodies, indicating movements, struggles, and the methodical nature of the attacks. Every object, every mark, every disturbance at home contributed to this reconstruction. The breakdown of the crime scene revealed the grim efficiency of the perpetrator, who had likely moved with a predatory purpose, having prior knowledge of the home's layout from his earlier days as a welcome guest. The scene was not just a collection of bodies, but a narrative of terror, a testament to the rage that had been unleashed within those walls. This initial assessment provided crucial insights into the nature of the crime and the likely identity of the perpetrator, immediately pointing towards someone with an intimate knowledge of the family and the home. The immediate aftermath spurred a rapid and extensive law enforcement process. Detectives initiated a full-scale murder investigation, working tirelessly to gather evidence and apprehend the killer. One of the first and most critical steps involved gathering evidence. This included forensic samples from the scene, fingerprints, DNA, footprints, and weapon traces. Every minute detail, no matter how small, was meticulously collected and cataloged. Simultaneously, investigators began tracking his phone records. This involved obtaining warrants to access Michael Thorne's call logs, text messages, and location data, allowing them to trace his movements before, during, and after the murders. His digital footprint provided an undeniable timeline of his escalating obsession and his presence in the vicinity of the crime. Furthermore, police began tracking purchase records, looking for any recent acquisitions that could be linked to crime, perhaps the purchase of a specific weapon, tools for forced entry, or items used in concealment. This could also include tracing his financial transactions or cash withdrawals that might have facilitated his movements. His vehicle became another key piece of the puzzle, leading to tracing his car through traffic cameras, license plate readers, or witness sightings, allowing investigators to reconstruct his travel patterns and pinpoint his location at critical times. Parallel to the technical evidence collection, witness testimonies about his behavior became crucial. Friends, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances who had interacted with Michael in the weeks leading up to the murders were interviewed. Their accounts of his increasing erratic behavior, his aggressive messages, his violent outbursts, and his fixation on Jessica provided invaluable context and a clear motive for the crime. These testimonies corroborated the physical evidence, building an irrefutable case against him. The collective weight of this evidence, forensic, digital, and testimonial, left law enforcement with a clear path to Michael Thorne. The culmination of this intensive investigation led to a precise and decisive reenactment of his arrest. Footage would show a tactical team meticulously planning and executing the raid on a suspected location, perhaps a secluded apartment, a hideout, or a place where he believed he was safe. The scene would depict him being taken into custody, perhaps in a sudden, overwhelming show of force, or a more contained, but equally definitive apprehension. The image of him in handcuffs, shackled, and escorted by officers would symbolize the finality of his capture, the end of his freedom, and the beginning of his accountability. Once apprehended, Michael Thorne faced the full weight of the legal proceedings. The courtroom scenes would depict the formal charges being read, multiple counts of murder, representing each life he had taken. The environment of the courtroom would be stark, emphasizing the gravity of the charges and the seriousness of the legal process. The prosecutor's speech will methodically outline the compelling case against Michael, presenting the overwhelming evidence and meticulously detailing his motive, the clear progression from rejected love to destructive resentment and premeditated murder. The prosecution would dissect his actions, his obsession, and his chilling forethought, painting a clear picture of a vengeful killer. The defense narrative, while present, would be dismissed as insufficient. It might attempt to portray the crime as a crime of passion, arguing for a lesser degree of culpability due to extreme emotional disturbance. However, the meticulously collected evidence of premeditation, the planning, the tracking, the deliberate entry, and the sequence of murders would systematically dismantle this argument. The deliberate nature of his actions, not a spontaneous act of rage, would become evident. The trial would inevitably lead to a guilty verdict, a decision rendered by a jury convinced by the irrefutable evidence. This moment would be conveyed with a sense of solemn finality, a collective acknowledgement of justice. The subsequent sentencing would follow, with Michael Thorne receiving life sentences or, depending on the jurisdiction, the death penalty, a legal consequence commensurate with the horrific nature of his crimes. The reaction in the courtroom would be profound. The family's emotional reactions would be a poignant blend of tears, relief, and profound grief. There would be a sense of closure for them, but also an enduring sadness for the lives brutally taken. This marked the formal end of Michael Thorne's destructive path and a legal reckoning.
Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more.